James walked slowly through the park, his footsteps heavy along the worn path. The cool night air brushed against his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was lost in memories of happier times, when his beloved wife had been by his side. He let out a deep sigh, the familiar ache in his chest tightening. It had been 3 years since she passed, yet the pain still felt as fresh as the day it happened. Ahead, the park bench where they used to sit together stood empty, a stark reminder of his loneliness. As James rounded the bend, a faint sound broke through his thoughts. He stopped, tilting his head to listen. There it was again, a soft whimper, barely audible over the rustling leaves. Concern and curiosity stirred in him as he followed the sound, leading him off the path and toward a cluster of bushes. The whimper grew into a mournful cry as he approached, his heart pounding in his chest. Gently pushing aside the branches, he froze. Nestled in the grass was a wicker basket, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Inside was a tiny baby, its face scrunched up in distress, tears rolling down its chubby cheeks. James's breath caught in his throat. Without a moment's hesitation, he knelt down and carefully lifted the child into his arms. "Shh. It's all right, little one," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you now." The baby's cries quieted as James cradled it close, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of the child's parents. But the park was empty. There was no explanation for why this fragile life had been left alone. Tears welled up in James's eyes as he gazed at the child. In that instant, something inside him shifted. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long began to ebb away, replaced by a fierce sense of protection for the vulnerable soul in his arms. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'll take care of you. You're safe now." Holding the baby tightly, James turned and hurried back toward the park's entrance, his mind racing with questions and fears. But one thing was clear: he couldn't leave this child alone. Whatever happened next, James knew his life would never be the same. As he rushed home, cradling the small bundle against his chest, his heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The baby shifted in his arms, letting out a soft whimper. "It's okay, little one," James murmured, soothing the child. "We're almost there." When he stepped into his modest house, the silence that usually greeted him was replaced by the gentle coos of the baby. Carefully, James laid the infant on the couch, surrounding it with pillows to keep it safe. He stepped back, running a hand through his graying hair, the weight of the situation settling in. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. "I'm too old for this. I can't raise a child alone." He paced the living room, glancing nervously at the baby, who was now contentedly sucking on its tiny fist. The enormity of caring for a child overwhelmed him. He thought about his age, the sleepless nights that lay ahead, and the challenges of being a single parent. But as he looked at the baby's innocent face, a warmth spread through his chest. He remembered the love he and his wife had shared, and how they had always wanted children. Maybe this was a second chance at that dream. "Daniel," James said softly, the name coming to him suddenly. "I think I'll call you Daniel." The baby gurgled in response, its big eyes locking onto James. In that moment, James's doubts began to fade. He knew he couldn't walk away from this child, not when he had the ability to offer a loving home. "All right, Daniel," he said gently, picking up the baby once more. "How about we start this new chapter together? I'll take care of you for now, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." As Daniel nestled in his arms, James felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it. James's life had transformed overnight with Daniel's arrival. The once quiet house now echoed with the cries and coos of a baby, filling the previously empty rooms with new life. James fumbled through diaper changes and bottle feedings, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to recall the proper techniques. Sleepless nights became routine, as Daniel woke every few hours, hungry or in need of comfort. James would stumble out of bed, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his heart filled with love for the tiny being that depended on him. "It's all right, buddy," James would murmur, rocking Daniel gently as he paced the living room. "We're in this together." Despite the hardships, James found unexpected joy in the small moments. Daniel's first toothless smile made his heart ache, and the way the baby's tiny hand wrapped around his finger filled him with a sense of purpose he thought he had lost forever. As days turned into weeks, James settled into a routine. He learned to anticipate Daniel's needs, and his movements became more confident as he cared for the baby. The house, once a constant reminder of his loneliness, now felt warm and alive. James's neighbors couldn't help but notice the change in him. Mrs. Cruz, who lived next door, saw James in his yard on a sunny afternoon, Daniel nestled in a baby carrier on his chest. "Well, look at the two of you," she called out, smiling. "James, I haven't seen you this happy in years." James felt his cheeks flush with pride. "This little guy has changed everything," he admitted, gently patting Daniel's back. As he spoke with Mrs. Cruz, James realized how much his life had transformed. The grief that had weighed him down for so long now felt lighter, replaced by the sweet burden of caring for Daniel. Though challenges lay ahead, James knew he had found a new purpose, one that filled his heart with hope and love. James took a deep breath as he stood outside the courthouse. Daniel nestled in his arms. Today was the day he would officially become Daniel's father. His heart raced with a mix of excitement and nerves. Inside, James had faced a mountain of paperwork and questions from social workers and attorneys. They asked about his income, his health, and his ability to care for a child at his age. James answered each question with determination, his love for Daniel clear in every word. "Mr. Carlson," the judge said, peering over his glasses, "raising a child on your own is a significant challenge. Are you certain you're prepared for this responsibility?" James looked down at Daniel, who gazed back at him with trusting eyes. "Your Honor," he responded, his voice steady, "I know it won't be easy, but Daniel has already brought so much joy to my life. I can't imagine not being there for him." The process was long and emotionally draining. James felt as though his entire life was under a microscope. But when the judge finally declared Daniel officially his son, tears of joy streamed down James's face. As they left the courthouse, James's neighbors were waiting outside. Mrs. Cruz rushed forward, wrapping both of them in a warm embrace. "Congratulations, James. We're all so happy for you," she exclaimed. Mr. Johnson from across the street clapped James on the back. "You're a brave man, James. If you need any help, just holler." But not everyone was so supportive. James overheard Mrs. Peterson whispering to another neighbor, questioning how a man his age could possibly care for a young child. For a moment, doubt flickered in his heart, but he pushed it aside. He knew there would be obstacles, but he was ready to face them head-on. That night, as he cradled Daniel in his arms, James felt a deep sense of peace. No matter what lay ahead, they were in it together, and that was all that mattered. As James tucked Daniel into bed, he whispered, "We're officially a family now, little one. I promise to do my best every day." He took a deep breath as they stood outside the Sunshine Daycare, holding Daniel's tiny hand. The colorful building looked welcoming, but James couldn't shake the nervous flutter in his stomach. This was a big step for both of them. As they entered the cozy space, they were greeted by a warm voice. "You must be James and Daniel. I'm Miss Sarah, the head teacher here." James nodded, his voice slightly shaky. "Nice to meet you, Miss Sarah. It's our first day." Miss Sarah knelt down to Daniel's level. "Hello, Daniel. We're going to have so much fun today." Daniel clung to James's leg, peeking out shyly. James patted his back gently. "It's okay, buddy. Remember what we talked about? You're going to make new friends and play with lots of toys." Over the next few weeks, James found himself juggling his work schedule with drop-offs and pickups. It wasn't easy, but seeing Daniel's face light up as he excitedly talked about his day made it all worthwhile. One afternoon, when James arrived to pick up Daniel, he noticed another father struggling with a pile of paperwork and a squirming child. Without hesitation, James stepped in to help. "Thanks, man," the father said gratefully. "I'm Tom, by the way." "Katie James," he replied with a smile. "Daniel's dad." From that day on, James found himself part of an unexpected support network. He and Tom began swapping parenting tips and occasionally grabbing coffee after dropping off their kids. Other parents joined in, and soon James had an entire group of friends who understood the joys and challenges of raising little ones. Laughter filled the once quiet rooms of James's house, and he marveled at each new milestone. The first time Daniel sang the alphabet song. His wobbly first steps. The day he finally mastered using a spoon without spilling. One night, as James tucked Daniel into bed, the little boy wrapped his arms around James's neck. "I love you, Daddy," Daniel murmured sleepily. James's heart swelled with joy. "I love you too, buddy," he whispered, realizing that his house had truly become a home again. James settled into a comfortable routine with Daniel, finding joy in the simple moments of daily life. Every morning, he woke up to the sound of Daniel's giggles coming through the baby monitor. Smiling, James would stretch and head to the nursery. "Good morning, little man," James would say, scooping Daniel up for a hug. The warmth of his son's small body against his chest never failed to fill James with a sense of purpose. After breakfast, they would spend time playing on the living room floor. James marveled at how quickly Daniel was growing and learning. He watched in awe as Daniel stacked blocks or babbled happily to his stuffed animals. "You're getting so big, buddy," James often said, his voice full of pride. Lunchtime was always an adventure. James laughed as he wiped carrot puree off Daniel's chin, thinking about how much his life had changed. He wouldn't trade these messy moments for anything in the world. In the afternoons, they would go for walks in the park or play with other families from the daycare. James loved watching Daniel interact with other children, his heart swelling with pride at his son's kindness and curiosity. As night approached, James prepared dinner while Daniel played in his high chair nearby. The kitchen, once a quiet and lonely place, now echoed with the babbling of Daniel and the clatter of pots and pans. Bedtime had become James's favorite part of the day. He would give Daniel a warm bath, dress him in soft pajamas, and settle into the rocking chair to read a bedtime story. As he read, James often paused to gaze at Daniel's sleepy face, overwhelmed by the love he felt for this little boy. With Daniel safely tucked into his crib, James would frequently stand at the door, watching his son's peaceful breathing. In these quiet moments, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that fateful night in the park. "Thank you, Daniel," James whispered one night, his voice thick with emotion. "You've brought so much happiness into my life." James knew something was wrong the moment he heard Daniel's faint cries through the baby monitor. His heart pounded as he rushed to the nursery. Daniel's face was flushed and his forehead was hot to the touch. "Oh, buddy," James murmured, his brow furrowed with worry. He cradled Daniel close, feeling the heat radiating from his small body. As James took Daniel's temperature, his hands trembled. The thermometer beeped, showing a high fever. Panic gripped James's heart, memories of his late wife's illness flooding back. It's okay," he whispered, trying to calm both Daniel and himself, but fear tightened his throat as he dialed the pediatrician's office. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and anxious moments. James barely left Daniel's side, giving him medicine and trying to keep him comfortable. Every whimper or cough from Daniel sent a jolt of fear through James. One night, as James rocked a feverish Daniel, he felt overwhelmed. Tears stung his eyes as he remembered sitting by his wife's hospital bed. "I can't lose you too," he choked out, holding Daniel tighter. At that moment there was a soft knock on the door. James opened it to find his neighbor, Mrs. Cruz, holding a pot of soup. "I thought you might need this," she said gently. "How's our little guy doing?" James's voice faltered as he tried to respond. Mrs. Cruz's kindness broke through his walls, and he found himself pouring out his fears and worries. Soon, other neighbors and friends began to show up. They brought food, offered to run errands, and took turns sitting with James so he could rest. Their support wrapped around James like a warm blanket, easing some of his anxiety. When Daniel's fever finally broke, James felt a wave of relief wash over him. He looked around at the friends who had gathered, feeling deeply grateful. "Thank you, all of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Mrs. Cruz patted his arm. "That's what friends are for, dear. You're not alone in this." James nodded, realizing that even in his darkest moments, he had a community to lean on. With Daniel sleeping peacefully in his arms and friends by his side, James felt a glimmer of hope that they would get through this together. He watched with a sense of relief, knowing that everything would be all right. As Daniel's health improved with each passing day, the color slowly returned to his cheeks, and his laughter once again echoed through their home. As he regained his strength, James felt an undeniable shift within himself. One afternoon, while they sat quietly in the living room, Daniel crawled into James's lap with a picture book. James wrapped his arms around the boy, inhaling the sweet scent of his hair. In that moment, the depth of his love for Daniel hit him like a tidal wave. "I love you so much, buddy," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel looked up with his trusting, wide eyes. "I love you too, Daddy," he murmured, snuggling closer. James's heart swelled, and his mind flashed back to the fear and sleepless nights, the worry that consumed him when Daniel had been sick. But now, holding his son close, he knew it had all been worth it. In the stillness, James made a silent vow. He promised himself that he would always protect Daniel, nurture him, and be the best father he could be. The weight of responsibility no longer felt daunting. Instead, it filled him with purpose and joy. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, James and Daniel remained embraced. James read the story aloud, his voice soft and soothing as Daniel's eyelids grew heavy, his tiny body nestling deeper into his father's chest. James closed the book and gently stroked Daniel's hair. "I think it's bedtime, little one," he murmured. Daniel nodded sleepily. "Stay with me, Daddy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course, buddy," James replied, his heart melting. I'll always be here for you. He carried Daniel to his room, tucking him into bed. As James sat on the edge of the mattress, Daniel reached out, grabbing his hand in a simple gesture that spoke volumes, cementing the bond between father and son. James watched as Daniel drifted off to sleep, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. In the quiet of the room, James felt a sense of wholeness he hadn't known since losing his wife. He realized that Daniel hadn't just filled a void in his life, he had given James a new purpose, a new kind of love to nurture. James often noticed how Daniel's eyes sparkled with excitement whenever they passed the toy store window. The little boy would press his face against the glass, pointing eagerly at a brown teddy bear with a red bow tie. James couldn't help but smile at Daniel's enthusiasm. One sunny afternoon, while Daniel was at daycare, James decided to surprise him. He walked into the toy store, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully. The shopkeeper greeted him warmly as James made his way to the display. "That's the one," James said, pointing to the bear Daniel had admired. "I'd like to buy it for my son." The shopkeeper carefully retrieved the bear and handed it to James. As he held it, James marveled at how soft and cuddly it felt. He could already picture Daniel's face lighting up when he saw it. That evening, as Daniel played with his blocks on the living room floor, James sat down beside him. "I've got a surprise for you, buddy," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Daniel looked up, curiosity etched on his face. James reached behind his back and pulled out the teddy bear. Daniel's eyes widened and a huge smile spread across his face. "For me?" he asked in awe, reaching out his small hands. James nodded, handing the bear to him. "He needs a name. What do you think we should call him?" Daniel hugged the bear tightly, his face buried in its soft fur. After a moment of thought, he looked up at James. "Mr. Cuddles?" he declared proudly. James laughed. "Mr. Cuddles it is." From that day on, Mr. Cuddles became Daniel's constant companion. The bear went with them to the park, sat at the dinner table, and snuggled with Daniel during story time. James noticed how Daniel clung to Mr. Cuddles whenever he felt scared or upset, finding comfort in the soft toy. Over the years, Mr. Cuddles remained a faithful presence in Daniel's life. The bear's fur became a little worn and the red bow tie faded, but Daniel's love for his fluffy friend never wavered. James often found himself smiling as he watched Daniel sleep, Mr. Cuddles firmly nestled under his arm. Now, sitting in the audience, James's heart raced with excitement and nerves. He watched as Daniel, now 10 years old, stepped onto the small stage at the community center. The boy's fingers fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, a telltale sign of his nerves. James gave him a reassuring smile and a thumbs up. Daniel took a deep breath and sat at the piano. For a moment, he closed his eyes, centering himself, and then his fingers touched the keys. The room filled with the most beautiful music James had ever heard. As the melody flowed, tears pricked at James's eyes. He remembered the day he found Daniel, a tiny bundle left alone in the park. And now, here was that same child creating something so breathtaking. Pride swelled in James's chest, nearly overwhelming him. The audience sat in rapt attention, many with misty eyes. James looked around, seeing the impact Daniel's music was having on everyone. A pair of elderly hands clasped together, smiling softly. A young mother wiping away a tear as her own child watched Daniel with wide-eyed admiration. When the final note faded, there was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. Daniel stood, his face flushed with a mix of relief and joy. He bowed shyly, his eyes searching the crowd for James. As Daniel made his way back to his seat, people reached out to pat his shoulder or whisper words of praise. James felt a lump rise in his throat, realizing how much Daniel had grown and how deeply he had touched others with his talent. When Daniel finally reached him, James pulled him into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you, son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel hugged him back just as tightly. "Thank you, Dad," he said softly. "I couldn't have done it without you." At that moment, James felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Years ago, he had taken a risk by opening his heart and home to a little boy. Now, watching the incredible person Daniel was becoming, James knew it was the best decision he had ever made. Standing in the doorway of Daniel's room, a bittersweet feeling tugged at his heart. His son was turning 18 soon, no longer the baby he had found in the park all those years ago. Daniel was sitting on the floor, surrounded by boxes of childhood memories, a look of deep concentration on his face. "Need any help, kiddo?" James asked, stepping into the room. Daniel looked up, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, Dad, just going through some old stuff." James nodded, sensing a slight hesitation in Daniel's voice. He had noticed a change in his son lately, a growing curiosity that seemed to weigh on him. Just as James was about to leave, Daniel's voice made him stop. "Hey Dad, look what I found." James turned and saw Daniel holding Mr. Cuddles, the stuffed bear that had been Daniel's constant companion throughout his childhood. The sight of it flooded James with memories, nights spent calming Daniel's nightmares, picnics in the park, and countless bedtime stories. "I can't believe you still have that old thing," James laughed, walking closer. Daniel turned the bear in his hands, tracing the worn fabric with his fingers. Suddenly he stopped, his brow furrowing. "Dad, have you ever noticed this tag before?" James leaned in, curious. On the back of the bear, there was a small label he had never really paid attention to. It wasn't the usual care instructions but something entirely different. Daniel's voice was low when he spoke again. "There's a name and a date on here." He looked up at James, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "Dad, I think this might be from my biological parents." James felt his heart skip a beat. He had always known this day might come, but he hadn't expected it to arrive so suddenly, brought on by a stuffed bear of all things. "Daniel?" James began, his voice gentle. "If you want to know more about where you came from, I understand. It's natural to be curious." Daniel nodded, still holding Mr. Cuddles. "I know, Dad, but I'm also scared. What if?" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. James sat beside his son, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "Whatever you decide, whatever we find out, it doesn't change anything between us. You're my son, Daniel. That will never change." James watched as Daniel carefully examined the tag on Mr. Cuddles, his heart racing. He knew this moment could change everything. Pride and concern swirled inside him as he observed the determined look on his son's face. "Wellington Toys," Daniel read aloud, his voice full of curiosity. "I've never heard of them before." James leaned closer, squinting at the tiny letters. "Looks like some fancy toy company," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Maybe they make special bears or something." Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving the tag. "I want to know more, Dad. Maybe they can tell us where Mr. Cuddles came from. Maybe even about my biological parents." James took a deep breath, pushing down the fear that threatened to rise. He had known this day would come, but it still caught him off guard. "Are you sure about this, kiddo?" he asked gently. Daniel looked at him, determination shining in his eyes. "I am, Dad. I need to know." James nodded, giving Daniel's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "All right then. Let's see what we can find out." They moved to the living room where Daniel grabbed his laptop. James watched as his son's fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for information about Wellington Toys. Minutes passed, filled with the soft tapping of keys and occasional murmurs of interest. Suddenly Daniel exclaimed, "They're still in business, Dad. And look, they have a contact form on their website." James glanced at the screen, his heart pounding. This was the moment that could unlock the mystery of Daniel's past. He watched as Daniel began typing a message, explaining about Mr. Cuddles and the tag. "How does this sound?" Daniel asked, turning the screen toward James. James read the message, feeling a lump form in his throat. It was polite, clear, and straight to the point. His son had grown into such a thoughtful young man. "It's perfect, Daniel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you ready to send it?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the send button. He looked at James, a mixture of excitement and fear in his eyes. What if they don't respond? Or what if they do and it leads to something big? James pulled Daniel into a tight hug, holding him close. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this, son. Never." Daniel nodded against James' shoulder, then pulled away with a determined smile. "Okay, here goes nothing," he said, clicking send. James watched the email on Daniel's laptop, his heart pounding. Wellington Toys had responded, and their message was more than they could have hoped for. They were inviting Daniel and James to visit the company's headquarters. "Can you believe this?" Daniel's voice trembled with excitement. "They want us to go." James nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. "That's amazing, son. But are you sure you're ready for this?" Daniel's eyes met James', filled with a mix of determination and uncertainty. "I think so. I mean, I have to know, right?" James pulled Daniel into another hug, feeling his son's body tremble against his. He wished he could protect Daniel from whatever they might discover, but he knew this was a journey his son needed to take. "We'll go together," James said softly, patting Daniel's back. "Whatever we find out, we'll face it as a family." As they started making plans for the trip, James found himself lost in thought. He watched Daniel packing and unpacking, talking excitedly about what they might learn. James' heart swelled with love, but also ached with a fear he couldn't shake. What if this led to Daniel's biological parents? What if they wanted to be part of his life? James tried to push the selfish thoughts aside, reminding himself that this was about Daniel, not his own insecurities. That night as James lay in bed, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What if the truth was painful? What if it changed everything? By morning, the weight of these questions hadn't lifted. When James walked into the kitchen, he found Daniel sitting at the table, clutching Mr. Cuddles tightly to his chest. The sight took James back to when Daniel was younger, seeking comfort from the same worn-out stuffed bear. "Are you okay, buddy?" James asked softly, sitting next to him. Daniel nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on Mr. Cuddles. "Just nervous, I guess," Daniel admitted quietly. "What if we find nothing? Or worse, what if we find something and it's not what I hoped for?" James reached out and placed a reassuring hand over his son's. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You're my son, Daniel. That will never change." A mix of anticipation and anxiety gripped James as he and Daniel walked through the gleaming glass doors of Wellington Toys headquarters. The lobby was bright and cheerful, filled with colorful displays and the distant sound of children laughing in a nearby play area. A friendly receptionist greeted them warmly, directing them to Mr. Thompson's office. As they rode the elevator up, James noticed Daniel holding Mr. Cuddles even tighter, his knuckles white from the strain. "It's going to be all right, son," James murmured, resting a comforting hand on Daniel's shoulder. The elevator doors opened to reveal a spacious office, its walls lined with toy prototypes and framed photographs. Mr. Thompson, a tall man with kind eyes and graying hair, stood up from behind his desk to greet them. "Welcome, Daniel and James," he said, shaking their hands. "I'm so glad you could make it. Please have a seat." As they settled into the plush chairs, Mr. Thompson's gaze fell on Mr. Cuddles and Daniel's arms. A warm smile spread across his face. "Ah, I see you've brought a very special friend with you," he remarked, nodding toward the teddy bear. Daniel glanced at Mr. Cuddles and then back at Mr. Thompson. "Yes, sir," he replied. "He's been with me since I was a baby." Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with recognition. "Well, Daniel, you're holding a piece of Wellington Toys history. Mr. Cuddles was part of a very limited edition series designed by our company's founder, Jonathan Wellington." James felt his heart skip a beat. He looked over at Daniel, who was hanging on every word. "Each toy from that series had a personal connection to Jonathan," Mr. Thompson continued. "He poured his heart into creating them for children who held a special place in his life." The tight grip Daniel had on Mr. Cuddles loosened a little as he stared at the toy with a newfound sense of wonder. "So, my Mr. Cuddles was made especially by the founder of Wellington Toys?" Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression softening. "Indeed. Jonathan had a way of making each toy feel like it carried a piece of his soul." James watched Daniel's face closely as Mr. Thompson continued the story. His son's eyes were wide with curiosity, and James could feel the growing excitement in him. "Jonathan Wellington was more than just a toy maker," Mr. Thompson explained, his voice full of reverence. "He was a brilliant musician and a creative genius. His toys were inspired by his love for music and his desire to bring joy to children's lives." James noticed Daniel leaning forward in his chair, captivated by every word. It was as if the story had awakened something deep inside him. "Jonathan had a unique way of blending melodies with his toy designs," Mr. Thompson went on. "Every toy in that special series, including your Mr. Cuddles, was created with a specific piece of music in mind." Daniel's fingers gently traced the worn fur of Mr. Cuddles, and James could almost see the gears turning in his son's mind. The connection between Daniel's love for music and this revelation about Mr. Cuddles didn't go unnoticed by James. Then Mr. Thompson's expression turned somber. "Sadly, Jonathan disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. It was a great loss for the company and the world of toys and music." James felt a pang of sadness at those words, but it was nothing compared to the look on Daniel's face. The boy seemed deeply affected by the news, as if he had lost someone he knew personally. "What happened to him?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "We don't know. One day he was here, working on new designs and composing beautiful melodies. The next, he was gone without a trace." James watched as Daniel hugged Mr. Cuddles tighter to his chest, a whirlwind of emotions playing across his face. There was sadness, yes, but also something more, a spark of curiosity and determination that James recognized all too well. "It's strange," Daniel said quietly, looking down at his beloved toy. "I feel like I understand him, like there's a connection between us." James placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder, feeling a wave of love and protectiveness wash over him. He could see that this story had touched something deep within his son, stirring questions and emotions that neither of them had anticipated. As Mr. Thompson's words sank in, the revelation hit James like a tidal wave, and he instinctively tightened his grip on Daniel's shoulder. "I'm sorry," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "Could you repeat that?" Mr. Thompson nodded solemnly. "Our records reveal that Jonathan Wellington was Daniel's biological father. He left behind a substantial fortune for his son, along with a letter explaining everything." James stared at Daniel, whose face had gone pale. The boy clutched Mr. Cuddles tightly, his knuckles turning white from the grip. "There's more," Mr. Thompson continued gently. "Jonathan designed Mr. Cuddles specifically for Daniel. It was meant to be a symbol of his love, a way for him to be with his son even when he couldn't be there in person." James felt a lump form in his throat as he watched Daniel's eyes well up with tears. A whirlwind of confusion and emotion churned within him. "But why?" Daniel's voice faltered. "Why did he leave me?" James pulled Daniel close, wrapping his arm around his shoulders. He felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with a twinge of fear. How would this change things? Would Daniel still see him as his father? Mr. Thompson handed James a sealed envelope. "This letter from Jonathan might answer some of your questions." He wanted Daniel to have it when the time was right. With trembling hands, James took the envelope, glancing at Daniel for permission. The boy nodded and James carefully opened it. As he read the letter aloud, his voice thick with emotion, the story of Jonathan Wellington unfolded. The talented musician and toy maker found himself in a dangerous situation, one that threatened his young son's safety. In a heart-wrenching decision, Jonathan chose to leave Daniel in a safe place, hoping that someone kind would find him and provide the love and security he deserved. James watched Daniel's face intently as he finished reading. The boy's eyes were wide, filled with a storm of emotions. James's heart ached for his son, knowing how overwhelming this revelation must be. "Dad," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't understand. He left me all this money but he abandoned me." James pulled Daniel closer, feeling the boy tremble with silent sobs. "Oh, Danny," he said softly, using the nickname he had given Daniel when he was younger. "Your father loved you very much. He was trying to protect you." Daniel looked up at James, his eyes searching for answers. "But why couldn't he keep me safe himself? Why did he have to leave me?" James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes life puts us in impossible situations. Your father made a choice that must have torn him apart inside. He wanted you to have a chance at a happy, secure life." Daniel held Mr. Cuddles tightly, burying his face in the soft fur. "But what about all this money? It feels wrong." James gently stroked Daniel's hair, his touch filled with love and reassurance. "Your father wanted to make sure you were cared for, even if he couldn't be there personally. That doesn't change who you are, Danny. It doesn't change how much I love you." Daniel looked up at James, his eyes brimming with tears. "You're my real dad, James. You've always been there for me." James felt his own eyes fill with tears. He pulled Daniel into a tight embrace, feeling the warmth of the boy against his chest. "And I always will be, son. Nothing will ever change that." As they hugged, James could feel Daniel's tension slowly easing. He knew there would be more questions, more emotions to work through, but for now he wanted Daniel to know he was loved unconditionally and completely. Jonathan's love was genuine, and it lived on through his son. "Danny," James said softly, "your father made an impossible choice, but he did it out of love for you. And look at the beautiful life you've had, the music you create, the joy you bring to others. That's your father's legacy living through you." James watched as a new spark of purpose lit up Daniel's eyes. The weight of his inheritance had been heavy, but now a glimmer of inspiration seemed to ignite within him. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice brimming with excitement. "I think I know what I want to do with the money." James leaned forward, his heart swelling with pride as he saw the thoughtful expression on his son's face. "What's on your mind, Danny?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I want to use it to help other kids like me, kids who might not have had the same chance I did." James nodded encouragingly, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "That's a wonderful idea, son. Your father would be proud." They sat together at the kitchen table, brainstorming ideas. James watched as Daniel scribbled notes furiously, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. The sight brought back memories of all those times they had huddled over homework together at this very table. "What about the old orphanage?" James suggested gently. "The one where you stayed briefly before I found you?" Daniel's eyes widened with excitement. "That's perfect, Dad. We could renovate it and turn it into a music school. James felt a surge of love and pride. "A music school for underprivileged children," he said softly. "Danny, that's a beautiful idea." Daniel's face lit up with enthusiasm. "We could give kids a chance to learn music even if they can't afford lessons. It would be a way to honor my biological father's love for music and his love for me." James reached across the table and clasped Daniel's hand. "I think it's a wonderful way to create something positive from your inheritance. Your father's legacy and your talent coming together to help others." As they continued to discuss the details, James was awestruck by the young man Daniel had become. The compassion and desire to help others moved him deeply. He knew they would face any challenges that arose in bringing this dream to life together. James watched with a mix of pride and admiration as the old orphanage began its transformation. The once dilapidated building was slowly coming to life. The walls echoed with the sounds of hammers and saws. He couldn't help but feel a lump in his throat as he saw Daniel guiding volunteers, his face glowing with purpose. "Let's put the piano room here," Daniel instructed a group of workers, pointing to a large space near the entrance. "I want it to be the first thing the kids see when they come in." James nodded in approval, reflecting on how music had been Daniel's lifeline during his difficult times. His attention shifted to a group of local mothers busy painting colorful murals on the walls. Their brushes danced across the surface, bringing to life scenes of musical notes and instruments. As the days passed, James was moved by the community's support. Local businesses donated materials, retired teachers offered their services, and families brought homemade meals for the workers. It was as if the entire city had rallied around Daniel's vision. One afternoon, while James took a break from painting, he overheard two volunteers talking. "You know, I never thought I'd see this old place looking so hopeful," one said, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's like the whole building is getting a second chance." The other replied, "Just like the kids who will be learning here." James felt tears welling up in his eyes. He looked over at Daniel, who was laughing with a group of children who had come to help plant flowers in the front garden. The joy on his son's face was unmistakable, and James knew this project was healing something within Daniel. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the renovated building, James felt they were part of something much larger than themselves. The orphanage, once a symbol of abandonment, was becoming a beacon of hope and new beginnings. However, James' heart sank as he reviewed the latest budget report. The renovation costs had soared well beyond their initial estimates. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. How would they tell the volunteers and supporters that they might have to scale back their plans? "Dad, is everything okay?" Daniel's voice called from the doorway, concern etched in his eyes. James looked up, unable to bear dampening Daniel's enthusiasm, but knowing they had to face this challenge together. "We've hit a bit of a snag, son," he said gently. "The costs are higher than we expected." For a moment, Daniel's face fell, but then a determined look crossed his features. "We'll figure it out, Dad. We always do." James felt a wave of pride for Daniel's resilience. Together, they brainstormed ideas to cut costs and raise more funds. They organized bake sales, car washes, and even a community talent show. James was touched by how neighbors and friends rallied around them, offering any help they could. Through it all, James saw in Daniel not just the son he loved, but a young man whose spirit and determination were transforming a dream into a reality that would touch countless lives. As they thought they were finally getting back on track, another setback hit. Heavy rains caused flooding in the basement, delaying construction by weeks. James watched as Daniel's shoulders slumped with the news. "Maybe this is too much," Daniel said quietly one evening, gazing at the puddles of mud around the building's foundation. James wrapped a comforting arm around his son. "Remember what you told me when we started this? That every child deserves a chance to find their passion, just like you did with music." Daniel nodded with a small smile, pulling his lips tight. "Well," James continued, "sometimes the most valuable things in life are the hardest to achieve. But we're not alone in this, Daniel." He glanced around as a group of volunteers arrived, armed with mops and buckets to help clear the flooded basement. James saw the spark of determination reignite in Daniel's eyes as they joined the cleanup effort. Throughout the process, James marveled at the strength of their bond. Each obstacle seemed to bring them closer together. Their shared dream kept them steadfast through the tough times. With every challenge overcome, James realized they were building something far more precious than just a music school. They were creating a legacy of love, hope, and perseverance. James stood in the newly renovated music school, his eyes scanning the freshly painted walls and gleaming instruments. The grand opening day was approaching, and he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride and emotion as he ran his hand over a polished piano. His mind drifted back to that fateful night in the park. He could still hear the faint cries that led him to the basket where Daniel lay, small and vulnerable. A lump formed in his throat as he remembered how scared he had been, wondering if he could truly raise a child on his own. "Dad," Daniel's voice cut through his reverie, "what are you thinking about?" James turned to see his son, now a young man, standing in the doorway. He smiled warmly. "Just remembering the day I found you, son. It feels like both yesterday and a lifetime ago." Suddenly, Daniel crossed the room and stood beside him. They both looked out the window at the playground they had built for the students. "I was thinking about that too," Daniel said softly, "about how far we've come." James nodded, his heart full. "We've had our share of challenges, haven't we? But look at what we've created together." They reminisced about sleepless nights when Daniel was a baby, the first piano lessons, and the countless obstacles they faced to bring the school to life. James chuckled at the memory of Daniel's first recital, and how nervous they had both been. "You know," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was so worried about letting you down back then. But you've brought so much joy and purpose to my life, Daniel. I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become." Daniel's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I couldn't have asked for a better father. Dad, you've taught me so much about love, perseverance, and giving back." Surrounded by the fruits of their labor, James felt a deep sense of gratitude. Every hardship, every moment of doubt had led them here. They had built more than just a music school, they had created a testament to the power of love and second chances. As James stood in the lobby of the newly completed music school, his heart swelled with pride and anticipation. The grand opening was just hours away, and he marveled at how far they had come. He watched as Daniel rushed around, making last-minute adjustments to the decorations and ensuring everything was perfect. "Son," James called out, his voice filled with warmth, "come here for a moment." Daniel paused his busy preparations and walked over, a mix of excitement and nervousness evident on his face. James placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Look at what we've accomplished," he said, gesturing around them. "This school is going to change lives. It already has." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining. "I just hope everything goes well today." James chuckled softly. "It will, son. We have the entire community behind us." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. James opened it to find Mrs. Thompson from next door, her arms laden with homemade treats for the celebration. "Oh, James," she exclaimed, stepping inside, "it looks absolutely wonderful here." More neighbors and friends began to arrive, each bringing something to contribute to the grand opening. James was overwhelmed by their generosity and support. He remembered how some of these same people had initially doubted his ability to raise Daniel alone, and now they were here, celebrating this incredible achievement with them. As the time for the ceremony approached, James found himself greeting familiar faces from all stages of his journey. Mr. Thompson had come from Wellington, beaming with pride at how Daniel had embraced his heritage. The daycare staff from those early days arrived, marveling at how much Daniel had grown. James' eyes misted over when he saw old Mrs. Jenkins, hobbling in with her walker. She had been one of the first to offer help when he brought Daniel home. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had supported them, James felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. They had turned their dreams into reality, and in doing so, had created a place where countless others would find hope and inspiration. Always ready with a casserole or a kind word whenever he felt overwhelmed, Mrs. Jenkins was there. James helped her settle into her seat. "I'm so glad you could make it," he said, giving her hand a warm pat. "I wouldn't have missed this for the world, dear." "You've done something truly wonderful here," she replied as the room buzzed with conversations and laughter. James caught Daniel's gaze across the room, and they exchanged a knowing smile. They both felt the gravity of the moment. This school was more than just a building, it was a testament to their journey, to the love and perseverance that had brought them here. James stood at the back of the auditorium, his heart swelling with pride as he watched Daniel take his place at the grand piano on stage. The room fell into a hush, all eyes fixed on the young man who had touched so many lives. Daniel cleared his throat and spoke into the microphone, his voice steady and clear. "This piece is dedicated to two parents, one who gave me life and one who gave me a home. Dad, this is for you." As Daniel's fingers danced over the keys, James felt a lump rise in his throat. The melody that filled the air was hauntingly beautiful, brimming with emotion and depth. James recognized fragments of the pieces he had heard Daniel practicing over the years, now woven into something entirely new and breathtaking. He glanced around the room, seeing tears glistening in the eyes of friends and neighbors. Mrs. Jenkins dabbed at her cheeks with a handkerchief, while Mr. Thompson from Wellington Toys nodded with a wistful smile. The music built to a crescendo, and James felt as if his heart might burst with emotion. He thought of all the sleepless nights, scraped knees, struggles with homework, and the small victories that had led to this moment. He remembered the tiny baby he had found in the park and marveled at the compassionate, talented young man Daniel had become. As the final notes faded, there was a moment of muted silence before the room erupted into applause. James wiped his eyes, not bothering to hide his tears. Daniel stood and bowed, his eyes finding James in the crowd. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, no words were needed. People began to rise, the applause growing louder. James saw Mrs. Thompson at the side door, openly weeping, her husband's arm around her shoulders. Even the grumpy old Mr. Grumpy from the street below, who had always complained about Daniel's piano practice, was on his feet, clapping enthusiastically. James felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Mrs. Jenkins beside him. "You did a wonderful job, James," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That boy is a blessing, and so are you." James nodded, unable to speak. He felt a profound sense of accomplishment, knowing that he and Daniel had created something truly special. This music school would change lives just as Daniel had changed his. As he watched his son take another bow, James knew this was just the beginning of a beautiful legacy. James took a deep breath and approached the microphone. His hands trembled slightly, but his heart was full of love and gratitude. He looked out at the sea of familiar faces, people who had stood by him and Daniel through thick and thin. Friends, neighbors, honored guests. James began, his voice warm and sincere. "I stand before you today with a heart overflowing with gratitude. When I found Daniel in that park all those years ago, I never imagined we'd be here, opening a music school that would touch so many lives." He paused, his eyes misting as he recalled that fateful night. "I was a lonely, lost widower, adrift in the world. But Daniel gave me purpose and all of you gave us support. Every diaper changed, every sleepless night, every triumph and setback. You were there, cheering us on." James's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of those who had been part of their journey. Mrs. Jenkins, who taught him how to properly warm a bottle. Mr. Thompson, who helped uncover Daniel's past. And each of you who believed in us, even when I doubted myself. His voice grew stronger as he continued, "This school is more than just a building. It is a testament to what love can do. Love found me in a park, wrapped in a basket. Love gave me the strength to become a father when I thought those days were gone. And love brought all of you into our lives, creating a community that lifted us when we needed it most." James smiled, his eyes shining as he looked at the children who would learn and grow within these walls. "I say this, never underestimate the power of kindness and perseverance. Your journey may not be easy, but with love and support, you can overcome any obstacle." He looked at Daniel, who smiled back at him from the front row. "And to my son Daniel, you've taught me more than I could ever teach you. Your courage, your talent, and your big heart inspire me every day. I am so proud to be your father." James watched with pride as Daniel moved from student to student, his gentle guidance filling the room with soft melodies and encouraging words. The abandoned baby had become a compassionate young man, and James's heart overflowed with love and admiration. As Daniel gently advised a young girl struggling with a difficult piano piece, "Remember, it's not about being perfect but about feeling the music in your heart." James smiled, recalling the countless hours spent nurturing Daniel's love for music. Now, Daniel was passing that same passion and patience onto these children, many of whom came from challenging backgrounds. As James walked through the school's corridors, he paused to admire the colorful artwork that adorned the walls. Each piece was a testament to the students' creativity and resilience. He stopped to chat with a group of children practicing their scales, offering words of encouragement and praise. "Mr. James," a young boy exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement, "I learned a brand new song today." James knelt to the boy's level, his face lit with genuine interest. "That's wonderful, Tommy. I can't wait to hear it at the next recital." Later that day, James watched one of Daniel's classes. He observed his son imparting not just musical knowledge but life lessons. "Music is a lot like life," Daniel told his students. "Sometimes it's hard and you might want to give up, but if you keep practicing and believing in yourself, you can create something beautiful." James felt a lump in his throat. Daniel's words echoed the same lessons he had tried to instill in his son over the years. When the class ended and the children left, James approached Daniel. "You're doing an incredible job, son," James said, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "These kids are lucky to have you as their teacher." Daniel smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And I learned from the best. Everything I know about perseverance and following my passion, I learned from you." Later, James sat at the kitchen table, A pile of letters and cards spread out before him. His eyes welled up as he read the heartfelt messages from families whose lives had been touched by the music school. Daniel entered the room carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "More mail arrived today," he said, setting a mug in front of James. "I can't believe how many people have reached out." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He picked up a colorful card covered in crayon drawings. "Listen to this," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "Dear Mr. James and Mr. Daniel, I never thought I could play music before, but now I can play 3 whole songs on the piano. Thank you for giving me a chance to learn to love. Sarah." Daniel's eyes sparkled with pride. "That's Sarah from Mrs. Castro's class. She's come so far in just a few months." James took another letter, this one written in a shaky hand. "This one's from an elderly man named George. He says his granddaughter attends our school, and it's given him a new lease on life after losing his children." As James sifted through the stack of letters, a warm glow spread through his chest. Each story was a testament to their impact, not just teaching music but providing hope and healing to those who needed it most. "You know, son," James said, looking at Daniel, "I think your father would be so proud of what we've accomplished here. His legacy lives on in every child who walks through these doors." Daniel nodded, his eyes misty. "I wish I could have met him, but in a way, I feel like I know him through the music and joy we're bringing to these families." James reached out and grasped Daniel's hand. "Your father's love started all this, and look how far that love has spread." They continued reading, their hearts swelling with gratitude and purpose. Each letter reaffirmed the significance of their mission and the profound difference they were making in their community. James watched with pride as Daniel led a group of children during the year-end concert rehearsal. The main hall of the music school was adorned with twinkling lights and colorful decorations, filling the air with a sense of joy and anticipation. As the last notes faded away, James applauded enthusiastically. "Wonderful job, everyone," he called out. The children beamed, their faces glowing with accomplishment. Daniel turned to his father with a broad smile. "What do you think, Dad? Are we ready for the big show?" James nodded, his heart swelling with love and pride. "More than ready, son. You've done an incredible job with them." Later that evening, as they locked up the school, James marveled at how far they had come. What had begun as a dream born from tragedy had blossomed into something truly beautiful. "You know," James said as they walked to their car, "I never imagined we'd be creating new traditions like this. It feels like we've gained a whole new family." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining. "I was thinking the same thing. Remember our first Thanksgiving after you adopted me? Just the 2 of us and a slightly burnt turkey." James chuckled at the memory. "And now look at us. We're hosting a feast for the whole school next week." As they drove home, James reflected on other milestones they had celebrated with their extended school family. The summer picnic where they surprised a student with a music camp scholarship and the impromptu party they threw when little Tommy finally mastered "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" after months of trying. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of their new life, woven together with love, music, and the joy of shared accomplishments. James looked at Daniel, feeling a surge of gratitude for the unexpected gift that had changed his life so profoundly. "I'm so proud of you, son," James said softly, "for everything we've built together." Daniel reached out and squeezed his father's shoulder. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Dad. You've always been my rock." As they entered the garage, James felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. Their home might be quiet, but their lives were filled with music, laughter, love, and the sweet melodies of children finding their voices. James couldn't believe what he saw as he read a letter in his hands. The local government had chosen their music school for a special community award. His heart swelled with pride as he looked at Daniel, who was busy organizing sheet music for his next class. "Daniel, come here for a moment," James called out, his voice trembling with excitement. "You won't believe this." Daniel hurried over, curiosity written all over his face as James shared the news. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise and joy. "Dad, this is amazing," he exclaimed, pulling James into a tight hug. "All our hard work is really paying off." James nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It sure is, son. And there's more. They want us to speak at the award ceremony and share our story." In the weeks that followed, James found himself swept up in a whirlwind of activity as the school began receiving visits from local dignitaries and representatives from various charities. Each visitor left with a smile and a promise to spread the word about the wonderful work being done. James watched with pride as Daniel confidently led tours of the school, his passion for music and teaching shining through every word. The young man he had raised was truly coming into his own, and James couldn't be happier. As the award ceremony approached, James felt a mix of nerves and excitement. He had never been one for public speaking, but the thought of sharing their story and potentially inspiring others filled him with determination. Standing at the podium with Daniel by his side, James took a deep breath and began to speak, recounting how he had found Daniel as a baby, the challenges and joys of single parenthood, and the unexpected gift of Jonathan Wellington's legacy. As he spoke, James could see the audience in the auditorium dabbing at their eyes, their nods conveying a deep understanding. "Our music school isn't just about teaching notes and rhythms," James said, his voice resonant and clear. "It's about giving children the opportunity to find their voice, to express themselves, and to believe in their own potential. In doing so, we create a community that supports and uplifts one another." Standing beside Daniel, James's heart swelled with pride as they watched the children performing in the main hall of the school. The joyful sounds of violins, cellos, and flutes filled the air, crafting a symphony of hope and possibility. James couldn't help but smile, watching the intense concentration on the young faces as their fingers danced over instruments that had once been mere dreams for them. He glanced at Daniel, seeing the look of contentment on his son's face, a mirror to his own emotions. Together, they had built something truly remarkable, a place where children could discover their talents and find their voices through music. "Look at them, Dad," Daniel whispered, his eyes gleaming with emotion. "Remember when we first started? And now?" James placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I know, son. It's more than I ever imagined." They watched as a young girl who had struggled with a difficult piece finally conquered it. Her face lit up with joy as she turned to her teacher with a radiant smile. A lump formed in James's throat as he recalled all the challenges they had faced to reach this point. "We did well, didn't we?" James said softly, his voice laden with emotion. Daniel turned to him, his eyes brimming with tears of happiness. "We did, Dad. We really did." They stood there in a comfortable silence, warmed by the glow of their shared accomplishment. James reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from that fateful night in the park to this moment of pure joy. He felt a profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought Daniel into his life and led them to create this beautiful legacy. As the music swirled around them, James and Daniel exchanged a look. They had built something that would outlast them, something that would continue to bring joy and opportunity to children for years to come. At that moment, James felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment, knowing that their hard work and love had created something truly meaningful and enduring. Walking alongside Daniel through the familiar paths of the park, the same park where their journey had begun years ago, James felt a wave of nostalgia. The evening air was crisp, and the setting sun painted the sky in warm hues of orange and pink. "It's hard to believe it all started here," James said softly, his eyes misty with emotion. Daniel nodded, resting his hand gently on James's arm. "I can't imagine how different my life would be if you hadn't found me that night." James looked at his son, marveling at the man he had become. The shy, curious boy had grown into a talented and compassionate adult who had touched countless lives through their music school. James's heart overflowed with pride and love. "You know, son," James began, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought I was saving you that night, but the truth is you saved me too." They paused at the bench where James had first held Daniel in his arms. Sitting there, they gazed at the park, watching families stroll by and children playing on the nearby playground. "Dad," Daniel said, turning to James with a smile, "have you ever wondered what would have happened if you'd made a different choice that night?" James shook his head, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Not for a second. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. And look at all the good that's come from it, the music school, the children we've helped." Daniel squeezed his father's hand. "We've built something incredible, haven't we?" James nodded, his eyes shining with pride and joy. "We certainly have, son. And the best part is, this is just the beginning. Think of all the lives we'll touch in the years to come." As they sat there, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of the park, James felt a profound sense of contentment. Their journey had been filled with challenges and triumphs, laughter and tears, but every step had led them to this moment. As he looked toward the future, James knew that the best was yet to come. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.